Royal Guard fires amid chaos, Prince George shattered by Camilla's daughter's actions. It was a bright and busy morning at the palace, where everything seemed to unfold according to the royal schedule. The sun was shining down over the sprawling estate, casting a warm glow on the gardens, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the grand hallways. For most, it was just another day in the life of the royal family. But for Prince George, heir to the throne, it was a day like no other. Prince George had grown up in the palace, surrounded by luxury, history, and the weight of his future. He had learned to carry himself with dignity, to smile through every event, and to speak with grace in front of the cameras. From a very young age, he had been groomed for the role of a future king, though the path ahead was not always as clear as it seemed. He had always been the center of attention, with his every move scrutinized by the public. But this morning, something was different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that seemed to hang just below the surface. The royal family, despite their polished appearances, had their share of internal struggles. Behind the scenes, there were alliances, old feuds, and decisions that affected not just the family, but the monarchy itself. Camilla's daughter, now a part of the royal fold, had always been a somewhat controversial figure. Her arrival had caused whispers among those close to the family, and even though she was welcomed into the royal circle, her presence had never been fully accepted by all. Her relationship with Prince George, in particular, was complicated. On one hand, they were family. She had married into the royal household, and they had shared some royal functions together. On the other hand, there were moments when George felt unsure of her place in their world. There were rules and traditions that everyone was expected to follow, and in his mind, not everyone respected them. It was something that weighed heavily on him, though he tried his best to maintain a positive demeanor, as any future king would. That morning, as Prince George prepared for the royal function that would bring together dignitaries and high society, he tried to push the thoughts of Camilla's daughter out of his mind. His duty was to the crown, and there was no time to dwell on personal feelings. He was a young man, a future leader of the nation, and his every move would shape the perception of the royal family. With a deep breath, he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, looking at his reflection as if reminding himself of the heavy responsibilities he would one day inherit. The event that day was one of those grand occasions where the royal family's presence was expected. The royal guard was set to stand watch, and Prince George would be required to make a public appearance. Everything had been planned to perfection. Every detail, from the lighting to the seating arrangements, had been accounted for. The function was meant to be a display of unity, a symbol of the royal family's strength and cohesion. As the day wore on, the royal family members gathered in the palace's grand hall. Camilla, who had been by Prince George's side for many years, offered a gentle smile as they spoke briefly. She was as composed as always, her elegance shining through despite the constant pressure that came with being a part of the royal family. But even she couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to linger between George and Camilla's daughter. The younger woman had always carried an air of defiance, and while some saw it as a sign of independence, George couldn't help but feel uneasy. There were moments when he wondered if her presence was truly in the best interest of the monarchy, or if it would complicate things down the line. After all, the royal family was built on traditions, traditions that, to George, were sacred. Just as the guests began to filter into the hall, Camilla's daughter entered with a confident stride. She was dressed in a gown that perfectly matched the grandeur of the event, but it was her attitude that caught George's attention. She seemed so sure of herself, so willing to break away from the norms that had governed royal behavior for centuries. To him, it felt like a silent challenge to the expectations of those who had come before them. Throughout the evening, as the guests mingled and the conversation flowed, George tried to stay focused. He knew this was a critical moment in his training as a future leader. Every smile, every handshake, every word would be analyzed and remembered. But despite his best efforts, his mind kept drifting to Camilla's daughter and the way she seemed to operate with a freedom he had never felt allowed. It was as though she had no regard for the unspoken rules that everyone in the royal family adhered to. As the evening drew to a close, the tensions that had been building finally erupted in a way no one could have predicted. What started as a small, seemingly insignificant disagreement between Camilla's daughter and one of the guards quickly escalated into something much more. It was unclear who had instigated the confrontation, but the noise from the altercation echoed through the hall, catching the attention of everyone in attendance. Prince George, who had been quietly observing from the side, felt a wave of unease wash over him. The guard, who had been standing at attention, seemed to hesitate, and in that moment of hesitation, everything seemed to fall apart. The calm that had once defined the royal family was shattered. In the midst of the chaos, Prince George realized that the family's unity was not as solid as he had hoped. The delicate balance that held the monarchy together had been disrupted by a single moment, one that would have far-reaching consequences. As the royal guard was forced to take action, firing their weapons amid the growing chaos, George found himself in a position he never imagined. His heart raced as he struggled to understand what had just happened, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, with security tightening and whispers of the incident spreading like wildfire. Prince George, though shaken, knew that he had to keep his composure. But deep down, a question lingered: how had everything gone so wrong? And more importantly, what would the repercussions of this day be for the royal family and their future? The incident that had disrupted the royal event sent shockwaves through the palace, and what had started as a simple disagreement soon spiraled out of control. The royal guard, whose duty was always to uphold peace and maintain order, had been faced with an unexpected situation. What was once a night of elegance and tradition had turned into a crisis, and no one, not even Prince George, could have anticipated how fast everything would unravel. It all began with a small disagreement between Camilla's daughter and one of the guards. At first, no one paid much attention to the whispers that passed between them. The palace was a place where tensions were common, and royal life had always been filled with political maneuvers and underlying struggles. However, this time, something was different. Camilla's daughter, with her free-spirited attitude and willingness to challenge the norms, had found herself in an argument that quickly escalated. She had always walked a fine line between fitting into the royal family and creating her own space within it. She was used to being the center of attention, but not always for the right reasons. Her boldness, which some had admired, had also caused friction with certain family members. While George and others in the royal family held onto traditions and respected the established rules, she didn't always share those same views. Tonight, however, her defiance would lead to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. As the situation grew tense, the crowd around the royal family began to notice. At first, it was just a murmur, a few raised voices that could have been dismissed as a minor misunderstanding. But as Camilla's daughter refused to back down, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Those around them exchanged concerned glances, and the sense of formality that had been so prevalent earlier began to fade. Prince George, who had been standing at the side, watching everything unfold, felt his stomach tighten. His role, as the future leader of the country, was always to remain calm and collected, but the way the situation was spiraling made it difficult for him to stay composed. The argument between Camilla's daughter and the guard was over something small, something that in the grand scheme of things might have been considered trivial. But the tension between the two grew, each party unwilling to step back. The guard, whose primary responsibility was to maintain the peace and uphold the royal family's image, found himself caught in a difficult position. His duty was to ensure the safety of the family, but the moment he intervened, everything changed. Prince George, who had been taught to always put the family first and maintain the monarchy's dignity, felt torn. On the one hand, he understood the importance of respecting the traditions and hierarchies that had defined royal life for centuries. On the other, he also saw the woman who had been brought into their world, Camilla's daughter, acting in a way that was not just defying the norms, but seemingly rejecting the very essence of what it meant to be part of the royal family. The voices in the hall grew louder, and the scene began to shift from an argument to something far more chaotic. The royal family, always the picture of composure and unity, was now at the heart of a public disruption. Prince George knew that whatever happened next would be a turning point for the monarchy. The guard, who had been trained to react swiftly and decisively, found himself in a position where his actions would be questioned. One wrong move could lead to a public scandal that would stain the royal family's reputation. It was at that moment, when the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, that the guard made his decision. In a flash, he raised his weapon, firing into the air in an attempt to disperse the crowd and restore order. The sound of the gunshot rang through the hall, echoing off the stone walls. In that single moment, everything changed. The room fell silent. Prince George's heart raced as he processed the events that had just unfolded. The tension that had been building for hours now reached its peak. His mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. Why had things escalated so quickly? How had the royal family gone from attending a formal event to a scene of chaos in a matter of moments? For a few seconds, there was nothing but the eerie silence of the hall. The guests, once lively and full of conversation, now stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Some were in shock, others in disbelief. The weight of the situation seemed to hang over them, each person aware that the course of royal history could very well be altered by this very incident. Prince George's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of the gunshot. This wasn't just a matter of personal tension between a family member and a guard. It was about the stability of the monarchy itself. The royal family had always prided itself on its ability to maintain peace and composure, to keep its image untarnished. But now that image was in jeopardy. The eyes of the world were on them, and the consequences of this night would resonate far beyond the palace walls. For Camilla's daughter, this incident marked a turning point in her relationship with the royal family. Her actions had set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. She had always felt like an outsider, someone who was both a part of the royal family and yet apart from it. Her relationship with Prince George had always been somewhat strained, but now, with the guards' reaction and the ensuing chaos, she had crossed a line that would be hard to come back from. The fallout from the incident began almost immediately. News of the event spread quickly, with every media outlet eager to report the latest developments. What had started as a small disagreement had now become the subject of global headlines. The gunshot, the tension, and the very fact that the royal family had been at the center of such an explosive moment were all anyone could talk about. Prince George, shaken by the events of the night, knew that the royal family would never be the same again. What had once been a symbol of grace and unity was now a symbol of division and uncertainty. For George, the weight of the monarchy had never felt heavier. He realized that, as the future king, he would be expected to face not only the public's expectations, but also the internal struggles and conflicts that had always existed within the royal family. As the evening wore on, the palace quickly went into damage control mode. Security tightened, and the royal staff worked overtime to ensure that the event would be spun in a way that minimized the damage to the royal family's reputation. But it was clear to everyone involved that this was no ordinary scandal. This was a moment that would define the royal family's future, and how they handled the aftermath would determine their place in history. For Prince George, the night had ended in a way he could never have imagined. As he retreated to his private quarters, his mind continued to race. The palace was in turmoil, and he knew that in the coming days he would have to navigate a delicate web of family dynamics, media scrutiny, and his own doubts about what the future held for the monarchy. The night that had begun with such grand expectations now felt like a distant memory. The grandeur of the palace seemed lost in the shadow of what had just occurred. Prince George found himself struggling to process the events of the evening. What had started as a simple royal gathering had spiraled into something far more complicated, something that threatened to disrupt the fragile unity of the royal family. As the hours passed, Prince George couldn't escape the haunting images of the chaos that had unfolded. He had always been taught to handle any situation with grace and poise, but tonight, nothing had gone according to plan. The royal family, for all their years of training and tradition, had been blindsided by a single, unexpected moment of tension. What was meant to be a peaceful event had turned into an international headline. The air in the palace seemed thick with the weight of the situation. Prince George retreated to his chambers, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. The consequences of the guards' actions were still reverberating through the hallways. The gunshot had been the turning point, but it was the aftermath that would prove to be even more difficult to navigate. The royal family, once seen as the picture of unity and control, now faced the harsh reality of being at the center of a public scandal. The media, as expected, had picked up on the story with fervor. News outlets around the world were covering every angle of the incident. each one adding its own layer of speculation. Some reports focused on the altercation between Camilla's daughter and the royal guard, while others delved into the broader implications for the monarchy. Prince George could already hear the questions that would come in the following days. Who was to blame for the chaos? Was the royal family in disarray? How would the monarchy recover from such a public embarrassment? Camilla's daughter, once a figure of some intrigue in royal circles, was now thrust into the spotlight in a way she had never anticipated. The young woman, who had always struggled to find her place within the royal family, now faced the full weight of public scrutiny. Her actions, which had seemed small and insignificant at the time, had snowballed into something much larger. Prince George couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. He had always tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but now he wondered if his leniency had been misplaced. The family's dynamic was starting to show cracks. In the aftermath of the incident, Camilla and her daughter retreated from the public eye, but not before a few tense words had been exchanged behind closed doors. The normally composed Camilla, who had always managed to maintain a sense of calm no matter the storm, appeared visibly shaken. She had never expected her daughter's actions to create such chaos, and the tension between the two was palpable. There were hushed conversations behind closed doors, and Prince George, who had always been observant of family matters, couldn't help but notice the growing rift. In the days that followed, the royal family was thrown into crisis mode. The media frenzy continued, and the palace staff worked tirelessly to manage the flow of information. Behind the scenes, Prince George attended countless meetings with advisors, legal teams, and senior officials from the royal household. Everyone had their own opinion on how to handle the situation, but no one could agree on the best course of action. Prince George, despite his youth, was expected to take a leading role in managing the crisis. His father, Prince William, had always been the stabilizing force within the family, but with the events of the past few days, George was beginning to see that his role as the future king would demand more than he had ever imagined. He was learning quickly that leadership was not just about public appearances or ceremonial duties. It was about making difficult decisions in the face of uncertainty. The decision to address the scandal publicly was made quickly. The royal family knew that they had to act before the situation spiraled out of control further. Prince George, standing alongside his family, addressed the press in a carefully worded statement. The words he spoke were measured and calm, as he focused on maintaining the dignity of the royal family. He expressed regret over the events, but stopped short of directly blaming anyone. He carefully avoided placing responsibility on Camilla's daughter, knowing that doing so would only cause more tension within the family. Despite the careful wording, Prince George's speech did little to quell the growing storm. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the royal family had handled the situation with grace and composure, while others saw it as an example of the monarchy's inability to adapt to the modern world. The royal family had always been a symbol of stability, but now that image was beginning to crack. People began to question whether the monarchy was still relevant in a world that seemed to demand transparency and accountability. In private, Prince George continued to grapple with the fallout. He could no longer ignore the underlying tension between himself and Camilla's daughter. The events of the past few days had brought their differences into sharp focus. Prince George had always been taught to prioritize the monarchy above all else, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the royal family was no longer the unified force it once was. There were too many conflicting interests, too many unresolved tensions that had now bubbled to the surface. Camilla's daughter, for her part, seemed to be retreating further into herself. She was no longer the bold, confident woman she had once been. Instead, she appeared withdrawn, her once defiant attitude replaced by a sense of uncertainty. The media continued to hound her, asking questions about her role in the chaos, but she refused to speak out. Prince George, despite the distance between them, couldn't help but feel a sense of sympathy for her. She was just as trapped by the weight of royal expectations as he was, and now she was dealing with the consequences of her actions in a way that no one could have predicted. As the days turned into weeks, the royal family began to settle into a new normal. The media coverage eventually died down, though the damage had already been done. Prince George, though still young, had grown up in ways he hadn't expected. He had seen the cracks in the royal family, and he understood now that leadership wasn't just about maintaining appearances. It was about confronting the difficult truths and making decisions that might not always be popular. The crisis had shaken him, but it had also strengthened his resolve. As he looked toward the future, Prince George knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He had inherited a monarchy in turmoil, and it would be up to him to rebuild it, piece by piece, decision by decision. The days that followed the royal crisis were filled with tension and uncertainty. What had started as a seemingly minor dispute between Camilla's daughter and the royal guard had now become a defining moment in the history of the royal family. Prince George, though still young, had become the face of the monarchy's response, carrying a heavy burden that he never expected to bear so soon in his life. The palace, once a place of calm and order, now felt different. There was a sense of unease that lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what had happened. Prince George, usually composed and poised, found himself pacing through the royal halls, unsure of how to move forward. Every decision he made seemed to carry the potential for more fallout, and with each passing day, the pressure only grew. Behind the scenes, the royal family was in crisis mode. Meetings were held constantly, sometimes lasting well into the night, as they tried to figure out how to handle the aftermath. Prince George sat in these meetings, listening to advisors and family members, but nothing seemed to offer a clear solution. The royal family was at a crossroads, and no one seemed to agree on the right way forward. The media, relentless as ever, continued to cover the scandal with a level of intensity that only seemed to increase over time. News outlets around the world were still buzzing with stories about the guard's actions, Camilla's daughter's behavior, and the royal family's attempts to restore their image. It was no longer just about the incident itself. It had become a symbol of deeper issues within the monarchy. The public's trust was fragile, and the royal family was struggling to regain it. In the midst of all this, Prince George continued to take on more responsibility. He had always known that one day he would inherit the throne and the weight of the monarchy's expectations. But he had never imagined it would come so soon, nor that the path would be so challenging. He had been thrust into a role he was not fully prepared for, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on him. Despite the challenges, there were moments of reflection during this time that helped him grow. He began to question the values and traditions that had been passed down through generations. For so long, the royal family had relied on appearances and control, maintaining a facade of perfection. But the events of the past few weeks had shown him that even the most polished image could be shattered in an instant. The monarchy, he realized, needed to evolve, to change with the times, or it would continue to falter. One of the hardest aspects of the crisis for Prince George was his relationship with Camilla's daughter. He had always found her presence in the royal family to be complicated, and now, after everything that had happened, the tension between them was more apparent than ever. She had always been someone who challenged the norms, someone who didn't quite fit into the mold of what it meant to be royal. But in the aftermath of the scandal, it became clear that her defiance had consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The royal family had always been about unity, about presenting a front that showed strength and harmony. But now, cracks were showing. Camilla's daughter had been thrust into the spotlight, and not in the way she had hoped. The media had painted her as the villain of the story, and it seemed like there was no way to escape the negative attention. Prince George, though sympathetic to her struggles, couldn't ignore the fact that her actions had played a major role in the chaos. It was difficult for him to reconcile the person he had once seen as family with the reality of what had unfolded. As the royal family continued to grapple with the fallout, Prince George found himself reflecting more on the nature of leadership. He had always been told that a leader must be strong, decisive, and unwavering. But now, he was beginning to understand that true leadership required something more: empathy, understanding, and the ability to adapt. He realized that in order to move forward, he needed to not only address the public perception of the monarchy, but also heal the wounds within the family itself. It was clear that the royal family needed to make some difficult decisions. Public appearances were carefully planned, and every word spoken to the press was scrutinized. But despite the best efforts of their advisors, the damage had been done. The monarchy's carefully constructed image had been shattered, and it was unclear how long it would take to rebuild it. The family's relationship with the public was more fragile than ever. The British people, who had once seen the royal family as a symbol of stability, were now questioning whether they could continue to be the symbol of unity they once were. Prince George knew that he could not undo what had happened, but he was determined to learn from it and to make the right decisions going forward. Amidst the turmoil, Prince George found solace in moments of quiet reflection. He would often retreat to the palace gardens, away from the hustle and bustle of royal life, to think. The gardens, with their tranquil beauty, offered a rare sense of peace in the midst of the storm. There he would sit and think about what he had learned over the past few weeks, about leadership, about family, and about the future of the monarchy. One evening, as he sat in the garden, lost in thought, his father, Prince William, approached him. They hadn't spoken much in the past few days, both caught up in their own responsibilities. But now, in the stillness of the evening, Prince William sat beside him. For a long while they sat in silence, neither of them speaking a word. Finally, Prince William broke the silence. "It's been a difficult time, hasn't it?" Prince George nodded, his gaze fixed on the garden before him. "I never expected it to happen like this. I thought I could just focus on the duties, on what was expected of me. But now I realize there's so much more to it." Prince William nodded, understanding the weight of his son's words. "You'll learn as you go, George. That's what leadership is about, learning from the challenges and growing through them." Prince George looked at his father, feeling a sense of reassurance. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. His father's words, though simple, carried a wisdom that George had always admired. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but at least he wasn't facing it alone. As the weeks turned into months, the royal family slowly began to recover. The media attention eventually shifted, and though the damage to the royal family's reputation was undeniable, Prince George felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood now that the monarchy had to evolve, had to adapt, if it was going to survive. And he was determined to lead it into the future, no matter how difficult the journey would be. The months that followed the crisis felt like a blur for Prince George. The events that had shaken the royal family seemed to have cast a long shadow, one that he couldn't quite escape. The public's opinion, though less vocal than it had been at the height of the scandal, still lingered in the background. Every time he stepped out in public, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the people's eyes on him, waiting for him to falter. But through it all, he had learned one crucial lesson. Leadership was not just about navigating through calm waters. It was about finding your way through the storm. The royal family, as much as they tried to maintain their composure, could not undo what had happened. The crack in their image was visible, and the public was no longer blind to the fact that the monarchy was not infallible. Prince George knew that their image had been damaged, but he also understood that it wasn't the end of the monarchy. It was simply a challenge that needed to be addressed head-on. Prince George spent many nights in quiet reflection, staring out of the windows of the palace, watching as the city below bustled with life. Life went on for everyone else, but for him, things were different. The responsibility on his shoulders felt heavier than ever. He wasn't just preparing for the day he would wear the crown. He was learning what it meant to be a leader in a time when the monarchy's role in the world was increasingly questioned. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to find a sense of clarity. He realized that the royal family's survival didn't depend on restoring an image of perfection. It depended on their ability to adapt. The monarchy, which had once been built on centuries of tradition and control, had to evolve to meet the expectations of a rapidly changing world. The world was no longer interested in the image of the royal family. They wanted substance. They wanted authenticity. Prince George understood that the royal family needed to move forward, not by pretending that everything was fine, but by acknowledging their flaws and showing the world they were capable of change. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Change had always been met with resistance in the royal household, where tradition had reigned supreme for centuries. But now, he had seen firsthand the consequences of clinging too tightly to the past. The royal family's inability to adapt had led them to a breaking point. If they didn't change, they risked becoming irrelevant. In the months that followed, Prince George took steps toward that change. He began speaking more openly about the future of the monarchy, about how it could remain relevant in a modern world. He wasn't just concerned with maintaining tradition for tradition's sake. He wanted the monarchy to reflect the values of the society it served. He wanted it to be a symbol of unity, of progress, of strength, but most importantly, of integrity. The lessons he had learned during the crisis, about leadership, about resilience, about authenticity, became the foundation for his vision of the future. As for Camilla's daughter, the family's relationship with her was still strained, but time had softened the edges of the conflict. While the public had not forgotten the incident, the royal family slowly began to heal, as did the fractured bond between George and his family member. Camilla's daughter, too, had learned from the ordeal. She had retreated from the public eye for a time, avoiding the media's relentless scrutiny. But as the months passed, she reemerged with a new sense of purpose, no longer just a figurehead within the royal family, but someone who was determined to earn the trust of those around her. Prince George could see that she, like him, had grown from the experience. She had learned the importance of understanding her place within the family, and while she still carried her defiance, she now approached it with a newfound sense of responsibility. It wasn't easy, but they both understood that the monarchy's survival depended on the family standing together. They needed each other, whether they liked it or not. In private conversations with his father, Prince George began to open up about his concerns for the future. Prince William, who had always been a steadying influence on George, listened carefully, offering guidance when needed, but also giving his son the space to figure things out for himself. The bond between father and son grew stronger as they navigated these difficult times together. Prince William's wisdom was invaluable, but George knew that the real journey was his to take. His father could guide him, but it was up to him to lead. The royal family's public appearances grew more measured, but they also grew more genuine. Prince George found himself speaking not just to the public, but to the family itself, addressing the issues that had caused the cracks in their unity. He didn't just want to be a figurehead. He wanted to be a leader who led by example, someone who could show the world that the royal family was capable of embracing change without losing their core values. As he began to take on more public responsibilities, George realized the full weight of the monarchy's reach. They were not just figureheads, they were symbols, and those symbols carried the power to unite or divide. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The monarchy had to be a collective effort, one where each family member played their part. Camilla's daughter, though once seen as a divisive force, had proven herself to be someone who could contribute to that effort. They were, after all, family, and if they were to survive as a family, they needed to find common ground. And so, little by little, Prince George began to forge a new path for the royal family, one that embraced the lessons of the past but was not shackled by them. The monarchy was no longer just a relic of history. It was a living institution, one that could evolve and adapt. And in that evolution, Prince George found his true purpose as a leader. As the years went by, the public's perception of the royal family began to shift. The scandal, while never completely forgotten, became a thing of the past. The family's willingness to face their mistakes and move forward had earned them a new level of respect. Prince George, now more mature and self-assured, continued to lead the monarchy into a new era. The world around him had changed, and so had he. The lessons he had learned through the crisis, the importance of authenticity, the strength found in vulnerability, and the need for change, became the foundation of his reign. He was no longer just the future king. He had become the leader the monarchy needed. The road had been long and difficult, but in the end, it had shaped him into someone who was ready to take on the responsibility of the throne. And when the time came, he would lead not just as a prince, but as a king who had been tested and had emerged stronger for it.